I will never forget the exact sound that started it all. The soft, practiced click of a disposable diaper box sliding under the back seat. The small, absurdly cheerful jingle from a baby monitor that someone had left running in the glove compartment. It was wrong, intrusive, a sound that didn't belong in my car at noon on a Tuesday, and it made the world narrow to a single, sharp animal perception that something private had been planted where I trusted silence. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 38 when I found out my life had been quietly rewritten. I grew up in suburban Cincinnati, went to Ohio State, learned how to fix a lawnmower and a spreadsheet with equal patience, and built a life that looked normal from the outside. A tidy ranch house in Westchester, a pickup truck with a dented bumper, and a career in logistics that meant I knew the rhythms of freight and patience. More than anything, I valued order and reliability. My marriage to Laura had, until that day, been part of that sensible architecture. We were the kind of couple other couples envied for being comfortable and unflashy. We had inside jokes about our two-person Netflix queue. We shopped at Meijer on Sundays. We argued about thermostat settings. There was, I thought, a promise in the everyday that the person you shared your coffee with in the morning would be the person who, at whatever loud or small crisis life threw, stood up and took your side. Mark Reynolds had been my best friend since freshman year, a part of my life so integrated I could no longer tell where the line between brotherhood and friendship blurred. He was loud, quick with a laugh, a little reckless with other people's opinion, and he drove a late-model Jeep with a radio that always seemed turned up. He used to crash on our couch in college. Later, he built an insurance practice and became the type of man whose presence made a Sunday football game feel like a family reunion. Laura met him at a tailgate at the quarterback club 10 years ago and liked him instantly. My two favorite people seem to orbit the same joke. There are simpler betrayals, the small ones, a forgotten anniversary, a cheap lie about a phone call. What destroyed me was the particular cruelty of theirs, an intimacy transacted like a convenience, the quiet calculation of two people who could map out how to keep living in my life while taking what they wanted from it. I discovered Laura's pregnancy in late March. She told me over our kitchen table, the daylight falling through the blinds and making the laminate look like a still lake. She had her palm over the test, like a child offering a magic trick. There was that abstraction of joy immediately. "We're going to have a baby," she said, voiced like an old record you believed because it was meant for you. I wanted to laugh or cry. I wanted to be what she wanted me to be, the father, the anchor. But there was a small voice inside me asking practical questions. When is the due date? Did she see a doctor? Did we plan this? She deflected. She smiled and said it was mine, like a benediction meant to stop me from searching for the truth. It was not that I did not want the baby. I wanted it desperately in the way people want a new season to prove that their life is not yet finished. I wanted the baby, the crib, the bad dad jokes. But I wanted it to be honest. And because I would always favor order, because infidelity is a problem solved by facts, I asked for a doctor's appointment and dates and a timeline. The way she answered felt like a negotiation I had not known I was part of. Warm, apologetic, a little evasive. There was a softness that should have comforted me, but instead it seeded a worry that dug at me like frost. I had suspicions before I had proof. Suspicion is a poisonous, ego-sliming thing. It makes your chest tighten and your breath short and gives you this awful sense that your house has become a stage where your worst fears are playing on repeat. Little things piled up. Laura's phone on vibrate more often, late arrivals from supposed book club meetings, a lipstick stain on a sleeve she could not explain away. Mark's presence in our lives became more constant in a way that wasn't casual. He sent more texts. He was the first to show up at our door when Laura claimed her heater had died. He lingered in our living room with a kind of proprietorship that shouldn't have been there. I passed those moments as anxiety, mine, not theirs, until the jangle in my truck confirmed a nightmare I tried not to finish. The diaper had a store tag from a small boutique in Newport, Kentucky, a place Laura and I had never been. I kept the box, like evidence in a case, like a sacrament of shame. Confrontation was a path loaded with consequences, so I did not explode. I watched, I listened. I became a man who learned patience the hard way, who turned every impulse into a question. It was cowardice at times, but cowardice that allowed me to see everything before I acted. I am no hero for that.
There are ways people tell the truth. The dramatic confession in a motel room in which everyone breaks down, or the sudden, messy exposure at a party. Ours was methodical. I followed handwriting, receipts, and hunched my shoulders against the cold logic of a timeline. The more I watched, the clearer the pattern became. Mark and Laura were careful in a new way, their treachery wrapped in the soft habits of my life. He brought flowers when I was at work and left instantly. She would come home smelling like a cologne I didn't own. They plotted around my schedule like thieves searching for a guard's route. When I finally had the proof, it was not cinematic. It was a photograph on Mark's Instagram account, a snapshot of Laura and him at a charity gala last December, both smiling too intimately for casual friendship. They stood too close, her hand on his arm in that private way that draws a line between friends and partners. I printed the photo, looked at the pixels until they softened into something I could not deny, and then slid it into a box with the diaper receipt and a handful of screenshots where Mark's messages to Laura read like confessions dressed as small talk. The first confrontation was not about the pregnancy. I needed to see how they would handle the knife of truth. I invited Mark to the bar we had gone to since our 20s, O'Malley's, the kind of place where the bar stools remember you. I called him because my voice would be easier if they thought everything was normal. He remembered the old times, the dumb road trips, the games we played at college. He was a man who had never believed that consequences would stick to him the way they stick to ordinary men. I brought up the photo like a casual anecdote. He gelled his expression into offense and then to an unnatural calm. He said it was nothing, said Laura and he were just helping with a fundraiser. The way a man lies is sometimes a kind of prayer. He says something until the world follows. I watched his chest and his shifting, the way his voice got small at the edges. I knew the sound of someone keeping a secret when I heard it, and I remember feeling very small, like a child learning how adult deceits sound. When I finally told Laura, I expected fire. I expected a cataclysm. Instead, she went quiet, like rain over glass. Her face tightened and then smoothed, as if it had been practiced in a mirror. She said he was just a friend, that the photograph was taken out of context, the usual rehearsed lies. She was calm enough that for a minute I worried I was spiraling. Men like me, men who reconcile their self-worth with steadiness, tend to assume everything is salvageable if you simply speak louder or longer. This was not salvageable. What I found in her eyes was not remorse, but a defensiveness that belonged to someone who had spent months building a fortress of small lies. The pregnancy became the pivot. The weight of that news was a compound of everything. A violation, the thought of a child's lineage being misrepresented, the deliberate theft of a future that until then I assumed was mine. She had used me as a placeholder. She had tried to pass something off as mine in the most literal sense possible. When I asked her directly if Mark was the father, she said with a weary, small laugh, "How could you even think that?" and then told me to be reasonable. The audacity of it, the attempt to shame my suspicion was staggering. They believed that my decency would bury my inquiry. It took me weeks to gather what I needed. I scheduled an ultrasound appointment under the guise of being supportive and then did something small and criminal. I shared the appointment with no one and left the stack of documents unlocked in my glove compartment. In the paperwork was a note from a nurse with the time slot and the fetal age that put conception around Memorial Day, a weekend I'd spent with Mark and Laura at a lake cabin, a memory now jagged with betrayal. I am not proud of how I got that tally, but the mouth was clean and the logic unforgiving. The first paternity test I acquired was a private paid one, a cheek swab taken during a visit that Laura claimed was for routine blood work. She hadn't thought to hide the paperwork for the prenatal clinic that had a partner lab. The results, when they came 3 days later, were brutal as a verdict. The probability of paternity linking me to the baby was 20%. The report used clinical language, cold probability that should have numbed me, but I felt each percentage point like a physical thing, like someone took a chisel to my chest. I taped the report to the back of the bathroom mirror and stared at it for a half hour, watching my reflection break into lines of disbelief.
I could have left, walked away and started over. Maybe a man in my shoes would have done just that, put some distance between himself and a small town with big memories, and started a new life out west. But there was a different thing inside me. Not only grief, but the desire for a kind of justice that would align the scales. I wanted Mark to feel the consequences of the moral arithmetic that he had flouted. I wanted Laura to understand that her betrayal did not end in private. It would be a reckoning. Revenge, I learned, is not a single explosive act. It is a sequence of patient, smart moves that make the other party understand their loss in every currency they value: reputation, money, relationships. Brute force is satisfying, but quickly forgotten. I needed something that would be precise and honest in its cruelty. I began methodically. Paperwork, emails, ledger lines. Mark's insurance practice had contracts that tied him to local businesses, and his accounts were not as tidy as he'd like to boast. Mark had a weakness for appearances. He liked the illusion of success and did not care to examine the scaffolding that supported it. I started with what I knew: a few clever, anonymous emails pointing to inconsistencies in Mark's licensing and some suggestive notes to clients about conflicts of interest. I did not destroy him financially, I am not a monster, but I nudged the attention of his regulators, the kind of cursory investigation that makes clinics and companies pause. It was like throwing a pebble onto a still pond. The ripples would complicate his life until he had no bandwidth left to hide. But reputation alone would not be enough. I needed the truth to be safe and legally undeniable. I hired a private investigator. It felt strange to be the man who paid someone to watch my wife, to look through trash, to confirm patterns I already knew. The investigator, a woman named Carla, who used to work for the county, had an eye for the mundane facts that become damning. Receipts from a motel in Dayton, timestamps of car entries, and a hotel keycard with the imprint of a last name. She brought me small artifacts, like a prosecutor building a case. Photos of Mark and Laura leaving a motel at dawn. Mark's car in my driveway for no reason. A receipt for a weekend away at a place with a spa where I had never been invited. Each piece fit into a bigger mosaic that made the story undeniable. When I finally confronted them together, I did it in the only place the two of them still regarded as sacred: my own home. I remember the way the house smelled: lemon and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke from a distant past. Laura tried to maintain a composure I once thought was part of her strength. Mark looked like a man who'd been woken too early for bad news. I placed the paternity test and the motel photos between us like a pair of blunt knives and told them I wanted honesty. They laughed first, not a release of guilt, but the kind of nervous laughter people use to measure how far the room will fall. Mark admitted to an affair, but not at first to its depth. He called it a mistake, a single misstep. Laura spoke in circular apologies that smelled of rehearsed lines. Their attempt to confine the hurt into a single evening was the last straw. I told them about the week at the lake, about the timing of conception, and watched as their faces changed color like bruises. The humiliation in their eyes was something else. For a moment, I felt the old warmth that had knitted our friendship, a reflexive grief for the man I thought Mark was. But the grief was quickly replaced by a rational coldness. They had thought themselves clever. They had thought themselves invulnerable. I wanted them to know how wrong that was. I could have raged and left a trail of destruction. Instead, I stated a series of terms that were tiny, deliberate humiliations and practical punishments. I would support the child emotionally if it was mine, but I would ensure legal oversight. Paternity would be established publicly. Mark would be given the chance to accept responsibility, but not without legal acknowledgement. I wanted transparency as a weapon, the public acknowledgement of betrayal. Laura scoffed at the idea of public paternity tests, but Mark flinched, and in that flinch, I knew I had leverage. The clever part of revenge is to make the other person believe compliance is in their best interest. So I offered Mark a way out that looked like relief. Take responsibility privately or face public exposure and the ruin it would bring. He chose privately at first, an act of cowardice disguised as pragmatism.
He moved quickly to sign a document acknowledging his paternity, conditional on counseling and a modest financial arrangement. It was not absolution. It was meticulous damage control. But I wanted more than paperwork. I wanted transparency that would reverberate in the places they valued. Mark's clients were neighborhood people, small business owners who trusted him with assessments and policies. I sent, anonymously, the paternity report to a few key references and to the local paper's tip line with a note about integrity. It was a small, surgical blow. The local gossip that followed was the sound of reputations being peeled away, the kind of slow unwrapping that feels like the exposure of raw nerve. Mark's practice dwindled as clients called and asked gentle, probing questions about his commitments. The pillar he had built on his charm began to wobble. I did not tell them everything I had done. There's a terrible satisfaction in watching the consequences arrive without revealing the hand that set them in motion. It is a cruelty, perhaps, but one I think even now was tempered by fairness, by the belief that actions should have consequences proportionate to the harm done. The legal paternity hearing was a strange theater. Laura sat beside Mark in the back of the court like a guilty couple at a bad play. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a permanent squint, read the results in a tone made for tax law and probate. I watched both of them flinch as DNA matched Mark with a probability of 99.99%. The room made them small. They had tried to make my life into a lie. Law insists on specifics and names and percentages, and that cold arithmetic stripped their effrontery. When the judge ordered Mark to be named on paperwork and to provide financial support, I felt something like a cicatrix settling over a wound. It was not joy. It was recognition. Justice, in my head, had a pragmatic and quiet shape. There are those who would call this vengeance petty. Maybe they are right. But revenge is a language I had to speak, not to restore my pride, but to compel honesty. The months that followed were surreal. Mark paid child support, grudgingly at first. Laura tried to reconstruct a narrative where she had been coerced by circumstance. Friends we had drinks with avoided my calls, or worse, took Laura's side. The town is small like that, people choosing easy narratives because they hurt less than truth. Even as the practicalities of life reasserted themselves, baby registries, pediatrician appointments, and the logistical cruelty of feeding schedules, the relationship between me and the two people who had hurt me collapsed into something fragile and formal. I was not the kind of man to publicly humiliate Laura beyond what the law had done. The baby did not deserve a battlefield. Yet I was determined the truth would not be sequestered in a private folder. The idea that a child age of mine might grow up believing falsehood agitated me in a way rational arguments could not dispel. There were nights I could not sleep. I would lie awake and rehearse conversations that could not be salvaged. I thought about the small tendernesses that had once stood between Laura and me, the way she would heat my slippers in winter, the way we divided household chores with a silent efficiency that tasted like trust. Those memories became both ammunition and reminder. People are complicated. So are their motives. Sometimes they are cruel because they are afraid. Sometimes they are cruel because cruelty is easier than honesty. When the baby was born, a small, perfect girl who smelled like milk and hospital soap, the gravity of decision came back harder than any strategy. I held her once, my hands large and trembling, and felt a sorrow so great it was physical. I could not heed her. She had no part in their choices. I could, however, refuse to let falsehood settle into lineage like sediment. So I chose a path that mixed edge and mercy. I would be present on my own terms, but without lies. I would legally cement Mark's obligations. I would ensure the child never had to build their identity on a lie. The months after the birth felt like walking through a dimly lit house I used to know. Every room would trigger an echo, a memory of the way things had been before. I kept a schedule the way I had always kept schedules: appointments, visits, days marked off on a calendar. Routine steadied me. It is strange how routines can be an act of rebellion against the chaos people inflict upon you.
Laura tried to reclaim her once simple life. She started therapy, as required by the custody mediation, and would attend with a kind of dutiful humility that felt rehearsed. Mark tried to rebuild his practice, to re-establish trust the way a man patches a roof, shingle by shingle, with patience and a poker face. I was careful not to gloat. What I wanted was not to watch them suffer for the sake of pleasure. I wanted the world to reflect the truth. I wanted public accountability. I wanted, like many men of my generation, a rectitude that would not bow to cowardice. There are small cruelties in reconciliation. There were invitations I declined, social gatherings I avoided, friends who chose sides. But with every refusal, life clarified itself into a smaller, truer shape. The men I admired, my father, my uncle, had always told me to carry myself with dignity. Vengeance, I learned, should not be a spectacle. If the other person's ruin is inevitable through their own choices, humiliating them further is a cheap victory. So I gave them space to see their mistakes and to live within them. Mark came to the house once, 6 months after the baby was born. He knocked with that reckless familiarity, but there was nothing familiar in his eyes. He had lost more than clients. He had lost something in himself. He apologized in a way that tried to stitch back the old friendship with the flimsiest thread. I listened until his words exhausted themselves, and then said something I had not told him before. "You will never get a pardon for making me smaller than I was." He looked at me with the kind of shame that felt raw and real. There was not much redemption in it, only the honesty that sometimes a man needs to see how he has hurt another to stop hurting himself. I found a kind of closure not in spectacle, but in quiet acts that rebuilt me. I returned to things that had been mine before this storm. The small woodworking bench in the garage where I shaped picture frames, the Saturday morning runs in the park where I could breathe without remembering their faces. There was a dignity in the ordinary that revenge could not replace, and I began to accept that reclamation would be a slow work. People ask whether, when you exact revenge, you feel a change inside. I felt change, but not the aching satisfaction I imagined. The justice I orchestrated was practical and blunt. It did not fill the hollow of betrayal. It simply removed the lie from the child's lineage and ensured that the man who had been complicit would carry consequences. It was a legal and social correction, not a solve for the loneliness that followed. Laura relapsed in small ways. She would call when the baby slept, and we would talk like two strangers trying to be cordial about the same thing. Sometimes the conversations would be about diapers and milk, sometimes about memories of travel. The intimacy that had been the architecture of our marriage was gone, replaced with a civic relationship, two adults co-parenting a child born into a tangled truth. I found that co-parenting with someone you no longer love is a skill in itself, a practice of boundaries and decency.
The child, who should rightfully remain nameless here for her privacy, became my quiet reason to insist on integrity. I would take her to the park on Sundays, push her on the swing, and watch the arc of her feet. She loved to point at dogs and scream with that pure delight children have for the ordinary. Sometimes watching her, I would feel something unaccountable and fierce, a protection not born from blood, but from the fact that she would be raised in a world that honors truth. Mark's attempts to reconcile with me were halting and sometimes desperate. He would send messages that tried to be conciliatory and then back away. I accepted some gestures and refused others. There was a man I had known, the man who had shared beers and backseat confessions, and he was wounded in a way that made him less dangerous, but still unreliable. He tried to build a relationship with the child on weekends, under supervision, to atone and to keep a piece of his past intact. It was sometimes humiliating to watch him attempt to play a role he had not earned. But children are resilient, they welcome attention from adults, and do not care for the moral complexities that plague their parents. The years after the rupture taught me to be careful about the stories we tell ourselves. I once thought heartbreak was a finality, a clean break that left a person either destroyed or reborn. The reality is more nuanced. I was reborn in parts and destroyed in others. I learned to recognize the danger of revenge that seeks only humiliation. People often confuse pain for justice and mistake the momentary thrill of exposure for lasting satisfaction. What mattered more in the end was the structural correction, the formal legal recognition of paternity, the social consequences that made the lie unsustainable, the moral ballast of naming things correctly.
There were nights, months later, when I caught myself thinking of Laura in the old way. The comfort of her hand brushing my shoulder when we watched television, the cadence of her voice when she read something aloud. For a moment, memory and desire tangled into one, and I felt foolish and a little raw. But memory is a treacherous companion. It is easy to forget the sting when nostalgia softens edges. For sanity's sake, I kept a ledger in my head of facts, the motel receipts, the Instagram photos, the paternity test. They were not trophies. They were the bones of truth from which I had reconstructed a life. People who want stories of revenge often misjudge the emotional cost. They imagine a clean coup de théâtre, dramatic reveal, shattered glasses, a crowd gasping. Life rarely offers such well-angled spotlights. Moral recompense is usually bureaucratic and slow. Paperwork, lawyer fees, the way social whispers curl like smoke around a man's reputation. It is messy, and sometimes the law is inelegant. That elegance, the desire to mete out dramatic justice, is perhaps cinema's consolation prize, but the human thing is quieter. I remarried, eventually, to a woman named Claire, someone I met 3 years after the child's birth at a community theater fundraiser. She is not an antidote to any past mistake. She is a person with her own history and her own scars. She likes to garden, reads voraciously, and keeps a steady laugh in her throat. She does not ask for the shape of my wounds. She asks only for the honesty that now comes without coercion. We married in a small ceremony in autumn with a few friends and family. Mark did not attend. Laura called to offer a kind of hollow congratulations. The distance between us had become a kind of etiquette. The more time passed, the more I understood that vengeance must be calibrated. I had wanted a result that would protect a child and rebalance the moral ledger. I got it. Mark paid publicly and privately for his part. His practice continued in a diminished way, and his social circle became careful of him. Laura, for her part, had to live with choices that cost her a lot. A diminished reputation in a town that measures character in gossip, a frayed trust from people who had once been part of her daily life, and the internal tally that comes with being someone who took a route that left others damaged. The consequences were not theatrical, but they were inevitable, and there was a satisfaction in that inevitability. Still, all punishments have collateral damage. I never set out to harm a child. I set out to ensure honesty. If there is a moral here, it is that truth is a kind of mercy. It allows the people involved to live with facts. Lies, even small ones, calcify and become prisons. I wanted those prisons opened, not to punish for sport, but to unwrap a life that could continue in the light. The most surprising thing was the way people changed their minds about me. Some old friends judged me harshly for making a spectacle. Others quietly admitted they had suspected things but had been too afraid to get involved. I lost people who could not abide by the reordering I insisted upon. I gained others who admired the moral clarity I had insisted on, even if they did not agree with my methods. There is a peculiar loneliness to being the man who carries the truth out into daylight. It is a lonely clarity. On the day the paternity order became final, I felt nothing dramatic. I drove to the clinic and signed the last document, like a man tidying up a paper trail. There was no triumph in the ink, only a calm that settled over my shoulders like a second skin, the sense of having done the right thing in a world where right and wrong often blur. I am not an idealist who believes every injustice will be righted, but I am a man who believes in proportionate responses, actions that seek to repair rather than merely humiliate. Years passed. The child grew into a curious little person with my eyes but not my laugh, and the way she held a pencil reminded me of afternoons at my childhood desk. She called me Dan, never father at first, and later Dad, with that tentative claim every child makes when they try on a name. She would climb into my lap and fall asleep with her head on my chest. In those moments, the long and exhausting work of justice, the paternity tests, the quiet legal maneuvers, the social corrections seemed less about retribution and more about clearing a path for an honest life.
Sometimes I think of the men who will read this story and nod at the tactical cunning, at the way I marshaled facts like weapons. I want to be honest with them. There is a barbaric pleasure in making cheaters face the music and stripping their illusions of invulnerability. But there's also a deeper, fiercer imperative. To protect the vulnerable, to insist that children inherit truth rather than lies. My actions were guided by both impulses. I cannot pretend the first instinct wasn't personal, but the second was civic and, in my mind, necessary. Laura and Mark never again slipped into the easy intimacy they once shared in my house. They are both figures now in a life that exists parallel to mine. On the other side of a street we all walk, but rarely cross. Sometimes I see Mark at the hardware store and we exchange the kind of nod that means we do not share the same inner life anymore. Once or twice, when the grocery checkout was slow, he attempted a small, awkward conversation about the time before. I listened politely and kept my distance. One winter, years after everything had broken and then been rearranged, I dug out a small wooden frame I'd crafted in the days after the paternity verdict, when sleep was thing and my hands needed work. The grain was rough, the wood smelled like old cedar. I stained it and set the photo of my daughter inside it. Not a trophy, but a reminder. I put it on the mantel next to a photograph of Claire and me in Florida, a candid shot where we were smiling with the terrible unself-consciousness of people in love. The mantel is a quiet altar to the life I chose to live afterward. One rebuilt on honesty and the hard-earned calm of a man who takes responsibility for his own story. If there is an epilogue, it is this. Vengeance, to me, was never an end in itself. It was a mechanism for truth. In the years after I made sure the facts were out in the open, I watched people move through the consequences of their choices. I am not naive. I know people make mistakes and sometimes fall into darkness through no malice. But I will not allow my life or my child's to be used as a cover for someone else's cowardice. The price I paid, the loneliness, the labor, the social fractures, was high. But the result was something I could live with, a life restitched with truth and a sense of peace I'd thought impossible in the first months after discovery. There are mornings when I still wake to the memory of the diaper box in my back seat, and I feel that sharp old anger as if it were new. It flares and then ebbs. Time has a way of smoothing grief's edges. The
The rawness remains, but it is wrapped now in the quiet duties of a present life. School recitals, late-night talks with a wife who knows my history but does not judge it, the small rituals of fatherhood that are both humbling and ordinary. People ask me, afterward, whether I forgave them. Forgiveness is not a single decision for me, but a process. For Mark, I forgave the man he could be if he chose to be upright. I did not forgive the betrayal that made me a student of cruelty. For Laura, I forgave the child she helped create and the complicated motives that moved her. I never forgave the deceit that tried to claim a child as mine by default. Forgiveness in both cases was conditional and incomplete, because some acts leave scars that do not vanish with time. Yet forgiving in degrees allowed me to live without hatred, and that was perhaps the most important part of getting my life back. In the end, the sense of justice I wanted was not merely to ruin them, but to restore a moral arithmetic where truth mattered. I do not tell this story to boast nor to brag of some perfect plan. I tell it because I know men who find themselves at the edge of betrayal need a map. They need to know that it is possible to take a cold, clear approach without becoming monstrous, that it is possible to demand the truth without sacrificing one's own humanity. My revenge was not a pyre lit for its own sake. It was a path to a new life, built with the exacting bricks of honesty. If you ask me now whether I am at peace, I will say this: yes. In the way a man who has rebuilt a house that almost burned down can stand inside and feel the warmth again. The wood will always bear the smoke lines. You can see the places where we patched and nailed and reinforced. But the house stands, the child grows. Life, in its blunt, stubborn way, goes on. And that finally felt like enough.